The great Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who you've probably heard of, the Shawnee domain, at least the latter part of his life, when he tried to create a pan-Indian confederacy to take a final, like a last stand against the Americans by then, was recorded by a white person to have said in 1811, this was said to be a speech, but don't forget it's as recorded by a European or an American. He said, "But what need is there to speak of the past? It speaks for itself, and it asks, where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansetts, the Mohawks, the Poconockets, and many, many others, once powerful tribes of our race? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white men, as snow before the summer sun. In the vain hope alone, defending their ancient possession, they have fallen in the wars with the white man." Now, there's an aura of doom in that, isn't there? There's an aura of an ending already. Tecumseh would be defeated, indeed. But there's also that aura of the famous trope of the vanishing Indian. They're just vanishing. But no, they weren't. And we don't know if Tecumseh really said that or something like it. It's partly right, but it's perhaps mostly wrong. All of these nations, peoples, cultures of New England all spoke some variations of an Abenaki language. They were all in some ways part of a massive sort of extended family of Native Americans known as Algonquin. But virtually all of them survive today in some form, somewhere, in some size, except probably the Quinnipiac, who were located right here. Although we have lots of things named for the Quinnipiac, don't we? Streets, colleges, on and on, hotels, God knows what. There's a tendency in Native American history, and I know this is a very complicated problem, to speak of Native Americans as only defined by their genes, ancestry, or by their soil, land, or blood. Now, any of you who've touched a page of Native American history, taken a course in it, read, know that that's just not the case. Native Americans have become everything in our society, from members of the president's cabinet to CEOs to professors to writers, and yes, many still live in poverty on reservations. But dispossession being a huge part of Native American history is not all there is. Think with me also for a moment, speaking of that word Pequot, of Moby Dick. No show of hands of who's read Moby Dick at least in the last 20 years, or tried 20 times in the last 20 years. But what does Melville name that ship? The Pequod, with a D on the end. Common change of the term Pequot. The Pequot were a people, largely of Connecticut, eastern Connecticut, central Connecticut, and at their ending, at the end of the Pequot War, right here in New Haven, or this area around New Haven, such as they survived. But think of Melville's ship just for a moment. Who's on it? A lot of different kinds of people. There are a million interpretations of Moby Dick because Some of the time, Melville wasn't sure what he was writing anyway, except a series of phenomenal memories and philosophical riffs and a damn good sea story. But it's ultimately, isn't it, about a ship full of kind of humans from all over the world, including Tashtigo, the American Indian, on a voyage of fanaticism, on a voyage of utter obsession with this crazy captain. Who is Captain Ahab? Well, in the 20th century, he became Adolf Hitler and a whole bunch of other people. In order for certain of our political candidates to be compared to Ahab, it's always been my view that they should be reasonably intelligent first. Ahab was nothing if not intelligent, but he was mad. Mad Captain Ahab. Ahab's on a both spiritual and material journey. That ship is. Every whaling ship was. Every whaling ship was. Whaling was America's first major industry. And Native Americans did it first, right here in Long Island Sound. The peoples of the coastline. The saltwater Indians, as they're sometimes called. But that pequot is on a destined journey, isn't it? I mean, you begin to realize this is going to be a death ship, and you know it. And almost nobody survives, and one of the last humans you see on that beach after the ship has been wrecked and portions of it, pile up on the beach. One of the last things you see is a sort of grim form of Tashtigo. Who's been brutally dispatched at sea like everyone else. That's cheating, I know, when you use Melville, but he's hard to resist. Now, what is this thing called a legacy? I kind of didn't get there last time. I want to spend just a minute on it, because the 17th century, and especially these two very big wars, one smaller, Pequot War, King Philip's War, the one in the 1630s, the other the 1670s, left tremendous legacies all over New England, and they still do. You can tour New England and see sites of sorts, all sorts of sites of King Philip's War, if you have guides and if you know what you're looking for. Sometimes these are just commercial remnants. And by the way, Tecumseh in that 1811 speech, or whatever it was, is remembering these tribes, these peoples, by name, 150 years later. What is a legacy? We use that term all the time, don't we? Sometimes in universities it means your granddaddy went here. And maybe you have a chance that others may not, although that's less and less fashionable in universities these days. Some places illegal. But put that aside, what is a historical legacy? It can be an idea. Think with me just for a moment. Think how many times you've used this term, oh, that's a legacy of such. Or is that a legacy of such and such? Oh, those are legacies of the New Deal. Or whatever. It can be an idea that came out of some time in history. It got formed then, it got shaped then, it got changed with time, it got redefined with time, and damned if we aren't still redefining it. Take the idea of equality. Good God, it's an ancient idea, but look what the Enlightenment did to it, and look what the 19th century did to it in America. Look what the 1930s and 1960s did to it in the United States, and on and on and on. And a legacy can be an eternally reviving question at the root of a dream. Why is human equality so hard to achieve? There's one for the political union at Yale. Debate that one. A legacy can be emotional I mean, it can be essentially emotional. We don't maybe always deal with some legacies as ideology or as a thoughtful process. It just is our reaction. Are there trigger warnings from history that just cause us emotion we can't fully explain? Or blame it on our mothers? Or that legacy, if it's emotional otherwise, can manifest in habits of thought, assumptions, behaviors, lasting psychological patterns of struggle, action, expectation. My parents were both creatures of the Great Depression. Everything about them was a legacy of the Great Depression. It just was. Don't own insurance, my dad would say. Know where your money is. Okay. I didn't have any money. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend it on insurance. A legacy can be political. I mean, this gets messy, doesn't it? It can be very political, emerging in voting tendencies and recurring public policy issues. How many of us vote in patterns we've just kind of always voted in that pattern? And where'd you get it? How'd you get your pattern? I know how I got mine, although I've worked hard on it to hang on to it. My mother was a daughter of German immigrants. Her father was a founding member of the United Auto Workers in Flint, Michigan, and he thought Franklin Roosevelt was the son of God. He had Jesus off in the parlor and FDR on the dining room wall. I didn't understand that as a kid. Who's that? I knew who the guy in the parlor was because I had to attend the Lutheran church. Legacies can also be laid down in stone or in bronze. Monuments of all kinds. A monument is a legacy of something, of somebody. We've been living through in recent times a lot of discussions of just what monuments mean, or what they're for, or who put them up, and do they mean anything now? Do they mean what they meant in their origin? Why do we want to get rid of that one and not that one? Legacies can also exist in musical forms, musical traditions, artistic forms of all kinds. In art, we call that influences, including literature. We call them influences. Who was your major influence? And most writers will say, I don't have any. I'm sui generis. I'm original. A legacy can exist in law. God knows. What is law? But it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of precedent and legacy. If we follow it, or even if we don't. A legacy can be embedded in court decisions and in particular policies that change when challenged, or we revert to other practices in times of reaction. Law is all about legacies in some way or another. Know your case law. I mean, if you're in law school, or even if you're not. A legacy might develop in health and disease patterns. There might be a legacy in the disease tendencies we have. Why do they take down a history of all of us every time? You know, you've been to the routine. Every doctor or PI or everybody's got to do it all over again. Give your date of birth. Are these your 5 meds? Yes. Your father died of yes. Health and disease pattern. There's no medical research without legacies. Think about it. If medicine doesn't develop and grow based on the past, do we want to go there? Do we want our doctors to go back to alchemy? A legacy might be as local as a family story passed from generation to generation, very local, but could be very important too, right? Don't tell me what happened there because my grandfather did. Really? But a legacy can also be global. It can be global as something like national origin narratives. Legacies can be institutional, growing as part of organizations that exist to perform advocacy, preservation, protest, or the advancement of a set of ideas. An institution itself is a living laboratory of legacies. What is a university? We don't get up every day thinking that, unless you're in fundraising and development. A legacy might take form in an ism. Think about all the isms, such as abolitionism, legalism, originalism, progressivism, Afro-pessimism, conservatism, Ethiopianism, migrationism, and ism. Pick your ism. It's developed out of some legacies. Feminism in its stages. A legacy can be economic, evolving in all kinds of charts and patterns of growth and access or lack of access to material goods and services. There's no economics without charts. The charts chart legacies of some kind. Finally, we might even define a legacy. And I'm doing this in part because that 17th century, before Yale College is even a figment of the imagination of those 10 ministers that gathered out at Saybrook, they understood. They were all born in that 17th century. Most of them had lived through King Philip's War. That's very important to know. So a legacy might be simply that. An attempt at a definition here by one lone duffer. A legacy is that which is left over. It's like a living residue. In any society, after scholars have written their books, the clergy have preached their sermons, schools have created curriculums and taught the youth, politicians have made narratives out of a usable past, journalists have crafted all kinds of first drafts of history, parents have instructed their children in mores and folkways, and museums have mounted lots of exhibitions. A legacy, therefore, is any story, in whatever form or medium it takes, about which we argue or over which we contend for control and power. The most important legacies are probably going to be ultimately about power and who gets it, who keeps it, who has it. We breathe in and breathe out legacies from our past every day, in your private life and your public life. It's part of that thing we talked about now already called memory. Without it, we're not human. Now, that's the problem. These legacies can be toxic, terrible, horrific, and sometimes they just require a lot of forgetting. But often, they don't let us forget. You may have read Primo Levi, survivor of Auschwitz, author of one of the great Holocaust narratives or Holocaust testimonies. He said this before he ended his own life: the end point of the deformation of the memory of a committed fault is its complete suppression. We might want to completely suppress some memory because it's just too horrible, or dangerous, or damaging. Such suppression, Levy went on, of memory or responsibility for it, can result, he said, quote, from a deliberate intent to lie. But in other cases, we are faced with a fossilized lie, an ancient lie, frozen into formula. Sometimes we might suppress the past, the memories, the legacies, the troubles of the past, because we need to, we want to, we have to. And sometimes we don't even know we're suppressing them. And sometimes they just grow and evolve into what Levy's calling possibly a set of fossilized lies, stories that just get told and retold, stories that just harden. And we don't even know we're doing it. Frozen, he says, into formula. That can happen with memory. It's a problem in this story, to say the least. Now, I've already laid out my own sort of view that we don't have a choice but to face the past. That's partly because I'm a historian. If I didn't believe that, then I'm out of business. You don't need me. But the past will come find us. It usually does, when we least expect it. The northeast of North America, before Yale was ever conceived and created in 1701, was a set of peoples on lands they'd been on for thousands of years. There were the estimates run as low as about 125, 130,000, to as high as 160, 170,000. We can land, if we wish, as some scholars have decided, on about 150,000 native people lived in what we call New England. They didn't call it that, of course, in 1600, just before the English arrived on the coast of New England. Their names were many: the Pequot, the Narragansett, the Abenakis, the Mohegans, the Nipmucks, the Wampanoags, the Algonquin diaspora of these people. There are many, many more names. The Shattucook, Quinnipiac. Now, many of them spoke languages they all understood, but some of them up in Maine didn't even really speak the same dialects or versions of an Algonquin tongue as did the people down here in what we call Connecticut. Some of them had no relations with each other. Some of them were in conflict with each other, to say the least. Some were hunters and gatherers and to some degree migratory, but most of them were settled. Most of them lived in villages, quite substantial villages here in Connecticut, especially along the river valleys. And here along the whole Long Island Sound, the coastal peoples were great fishermen. In fact, one of the best books on this period, big prize-winning book called The Saltwater Frontier by Andrew Lippman, Indians and the Contest for the American Coast. He deals with the whole East Coast, but a big part of it is, actually the primary part of it is the New England coast, and especially this Long Island Sound coast. These people were great fishermen, and they built great boats to do it in, and they could navigate way up these rivers and out to sea. Now, of course, they experienced the devastation, the dispossession, elimination, in some cases, that came with the arrival of the English. 150,000 Native Americans in what we call New England in 1600. A century later, only about 10% of them were left. They were defeated and ruined first and foremost by diseases, especially smallpox epidemics. Then settlement pressure, of course, as the Puritan Great Migration kicked in and then further great migrations kicked in. They were also pressured by and ultimately destroyed by war, especially King Philip's War, which was in effect a New England-wide total war. And then they were also partly eliminated by enslavement and removal. Began with the Pequot War. This is explained to a fair amount in our Yale and Slavery book. You've already read that, I hope. It is the Pequot War that first begins the capture, sale, and removal of Native Americans from New England by the English, largely to the West Indies. Indians became, therefore, as Ned Blackhawk, my colleague here, in his recent book, The Discovery of American Native Peoples and the Unmaking of the United States, they became the first racialized labor force of the Northeast, and really were the first racialized labor force of a lot of the South as well. Again, many lived in settled villages that would become, in an astonishing short time, depopulated by disease. Now, my dear friend Ned also has a passage, and I won't even read the quote, but he has a passage where he says that out of this dispossession of Native Americans in New England, out of this destruction of so many of them, came slavery. And he's dead right. There's no question about that. We say this in the Yale and Slavery book. The beginnings of slavery in New England come out of the Pequot War, are enhanced much greater by the King Philip's War, and of course, because the African slave trade is happening at the same time out in the Atlantic. And the British, by the end of the 17th century, are taking over the slave trade. They're not taking it over yet in the early 17th century. But then Ned has a line where he says, but historians have not paid attention to this, or historians do not understand this. That's not true. There's a lot of books on this. I've had this conversation with Ned. It's okay. We're fine. We're great. We're fine. But it's just not true. There's lots and lots of studies of King Philip's War now by Joe Lepore, by Lisa Brooks, by Christine DeLucia, by lots and lots of other people, by Andrew Lippman, and on it goes. And Ned in his own book has a very fine section on the King Philip's War in particular. Now, so this is an encounter now between English settlers and the native peoples. Frontiers are always violent. That's kind of a given in history. As Blackhawk says, and others have said, it's not utterly inevitable that the native peoples would be just essentially wiped out from parts of New England or moved north and moved west, dispossessed, eliminated, or removed. It's not entirely inevitable because in the first years, there was a lot of mutuality. Indians were traders, big time. They traded with each other. They'll trade with these English people, and they don't mind getting some of these guns, and they learn fast how to use them. And by the way, the Puritans came to America loaded with weapons. Wendy Warren, in her wonderful book called New England Bound, which is on slavery in New England in the 17th century, has a whole list of the kinds of weaponry these Puritan ships were arriving with. Swords and daggers and all hatchets, and then guns and different kinds of guns, hunting guns and other kinds of guns. They were loaded for bear, so to speak. All right, well, who were these Puritans? Who were the Puritans? These Englishmen who came to, the image in an average person's mind of the Puritans are some just, obsessed evangelical Christians wearing strange black hats, big capes, were obsessed with their own piety and obsessed with your piety, or lack of it. They were inordinately interested in the sins of other people. They were separatists from the Church of England. What's going on in England from 1700s to 1720s, 30s, 40s? Well, it's the reign of Charles I, who of course is going to be killed in a regicide. It's the English Civil War that kicks in and lasted longer than the Brits even today want to admit. It destroyed so many of their monasteries, churches of all kinds. It ends up in a dictatorship of Cromwell and his followers, It was bloody civil war in England for damn near decades. The Church of England was corrupt. It had all kinds of, according to the Puritans anyway, it had all kinds of vestiges. Well, it did. It had all kinds of vestiges of Roman Catholicism, which these staunch Protestants, let's face it, hated. So the Puritans were separatists. They wanted to get out of the Church of England and finally out of England. They were persecuted badly in some cases. They believed their whole country had just become nothing but people worshiping false idols. Their motives were indeed God and taking God out in the world, but their motives were also mammon and material. Their motives were spiritual, but they were also pecuniary. When John Davenport and his buddy Theophilus Eaton left Boston and came down to Long Island Sound, right after the Pequot War, and landed here in New Haven and called this place New Haven, and created a New Haven colony. John Davenport, founder of New Haven Colony. Both of them were slaveholders, by the way. When they came here, Davenport was the Puritan minister. He was going to come here and save Calvinism like the others. But Eaton came here to create a maritime port. He came here for business, wherever they could find it. The Puritans had lofty goals, and they took incredible risks. It's kind of why people have always been, well, I don't know about anymore, fascinated with the Puritans. They wanted to create, in this new world, if you want, a New Jerusalem, a Puritan Israel. They use those terms frequently. They were on an errand into the wilderness, as Perry Miller, one of their greatest historians, once famously wrote in that phrase we all kept using. In graduate school, I thought that was said by God or something. It was said by Perry Miller. But this wasn't a wilderness. It wasn't a wilderness. It was all kinds of settled native villages with goods and foodstuffs and farming products, and there had to be trade. But their religious mission, if you want to understand the Puritans, you cannot understand them as just settler colonialists, evil to the core, out to destroy what's ever in front of them. They did a lot of that. But they were on a big-time religious mission. They wanted to take their church out of the world as they knew it and purify it. They wanted to take the elect, who are always a small group, although with time that's going to get larger and larger because they have to change the rules. In order to get somebody to come to church, you got to change the rules. And they will eventually create something called the halfway covenant. You could be halfway pious or halfway saved. Too often the Puritans are easy to make fun of. Well, think of other peoples in history who went on these the Crusaders. Who can lecture on the Crusades without trying a little humor? My God, what these people did to take Jerusalem and save it, they thought. Well, the Puritans were going to make a new one. And they were going to be a model for the world. That's audacious. We're not only right about our religion and right about our God, and only a few of us really get it, but we believe everybody else should have that chance, and we're going to take it to them. You've all heard of John Winthrop. If you haven't, must have arrived yesterday and never taken any American history, I guess. Although I don't know if we teach anybody. Maybe we don't even teach about John Winthrop. He made a famous speech, allegedly, aboard the ship the Arabella, which was one of the main ships of this huge Puritan migration to New England, landing principally in Boston in 1630. And aboard that ship, he gave the famous speech about a city upon a hill. And damn near every politician since has manufactured some variation of it. But Winthrop said a lot of things in that speech. We must consider that we shall be, he said, a city upon a hill. Often, we just stop there. Ronald Reagan used that all the time. Remember that? Is that we are a city upon a hill. And then he started talking about the Marines or something. The trouble was that cities on a hill, on a religious mission, can't hide. It's right up there. If we shall deal falsely with our God, said Winthrop, in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. What's a byword? Well, it means a failure, or it might even mean a joke. Look what we're risking here, folks. And then he went on. He said, our mission here is to suppress our individual wills in the interest of the whole of the Puritans. We must be knit together, Winthrop went on, in this work as one man. There shall be no individual glory. Puritans were also human. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must delight in each other, making others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. Yeah, John. See him on the deck of the ship. You go, John. It almost sounds like democracy. Puritans at this point were not Democrats, small d. They believed in rigid hierarchy. They believed in government by God. They believed in separation of church and whatever state. They believed in the utter mingling of whatever state they created with their religion. Now, if all we ever do is read that speech and then move on to, I don't know, wherever you want to be in American history and resume the story of progress, then what have you done? Because that sounds like a peaceable kingdom, a budding democracy. It's piety with a mission. Nothing wrong with mission. But Winthrop understood, they all understood quickly, that they had enemies and that they even needed enemies. If you're going to have a sense of chosenness, specialness, righteousness, you need another. You need enemies. And in this case, they believed they were, they knew they were, they said it every day, they were surrounded by enemies. And they were the Native Americans. Those Native Americans could be converted, and lots of Puritans are going to get involved in that, now, not least of which was Jonathan Edwards. More on him Thursday. He comes up, I put him in chapter 1 for a reason. You can all debate why I did that. Some of my co-workers on this project thought Edwards should not be in the first chapter. Whoa, don't soil up the first chapter with Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was a slaveholder, a very serious slaveholder. But he's still Jonathan Edwards, unfortunately. The pious need the heathen. Just like Aristotle said, the master needs the slave and the slave needs the master for their understanding. The great scholar of colonial and revolutionary America, Edmund Morgan, taught here for decades and decades, the great Ed Morgan, bless his soul, wrote many, many books about the Puritans, about the Revolution, about slavery, about a lot of things. But it's Morgan who coined this phrase of this Puritan dilemma, this American paradox rooted in the Puritan dilemma. The central Puritan dilemma, said Morgan, was the problem of doing right in a world that does wrong. Now, you could say that about all religious visions, I suppose, right? Religion, spirituality are ways of comprehending wrong and right. But they were obsessed with this. In Ecclesiastes, it says, that which is crooked cannot be made straight. But the Puritans were determined to try to do it. That's an errand into something if it's not a wilderness. It also says in Ecclesiastes in the first chapter, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new. It hath been already of old time, which was before. This is whoever wrote Ecclesiastes' way of saying, there's nothing completely new under the sun. What you're doing has been done before. You're not brand new on your city on the hill. And they're going to find you out. Now, these two wars, and I want to come back to these Puritans. I'll come back to the Puritans, don't worry. But the two wars of the 17th century sort of, I don't know how you want to put it, paved the way, made possible, were forces, human forces. Wars are not just something that happens because the weather changes and the wind blows. Although a whole lot of believers in the lost cause about the American Civil War seem to argue that it just kind of happened. Nobody was responsible. The Pequot War broke out in 1736-37. It lasted, well, most of 2 years, not quite. It was a struggle for control. Now think how early this is. I mean, the first Englishmen come, Jamestown 1607, but they didn't count that up here. The Puritan migration begins in 1620. The huge migration begins in 1630. Massachusetts Bay, a New Haven colony hasn't even been, a New Haven and then Connecticut colony hasn't even been fully created yet. It's only been around for 15 years, 17 years max. But this struggle will begin for control of particularly what was then sometimes called, still is called sometimes, the sheltered coast, the Long Island Sound coast. These coastal Indians, the Pequot in particular, they were not the only ones. At first, there were trade alliances between the English and the Indians. There was a good degree of mutuality, as I said before, but that breaks down pretty quickly because the English want land. They want the land, and they want control of the trade. They learn that they have to deal with these sachems, which were, we might call them chiefs today, but a sachem was more than just a chief. A sachem was a leader of a village, a community, a people, but he was in charge of commerce, sometimes foreign policy, and a lot of other things. The Pequot War in some ways began in two places. Wethersfield, Connecticut up here, where some native peoples killed a few Englishmen, and the whole community got riled up about it. And then it began on Block Island, just off Rhode Island, where some of you may go for vacations. Block Island had about 1,500 native people. As late as 1660, even after the Pequot War, a century later, in 1760, there are only 51 left. Pequot War and the King Philip's War is going to be a process of bloody dispossession and removal. What one scholar, Wendy Warren, prefers to call replacement. Now, English colonization is what's happening here. And there's a tendency in scholarship these days, academics, not without reason, are obsessed with colonization because it's happened all over the world. And almost everybody now gets called a settler colonialist if they're on the wrong side of this colonial idea. Colonialization has happened everywhere by almost everybody. In this case, it's going to be the subjugation and removal of people. And this is how slavery, chattel slavery, enslavement of people for labor and sale and trade, gets a foothold in New England and begins to grow slowly but surely. The English again needed land. They needed it for crops because they were going to become, and very quickly became, one of the feeding grounds and production grounds for the West Indian plantations of the British Empire, namely Barbados and Jamaica, the Sugar Islands. They also needed timber to build ships and masts, and they needed livestock. They needed land to pasture livestock, more land, they thought, than the Native Americans had. Any hope that is there in Winthrop's famous speech, any hope of a gentle, cooperative colonization of this land vanished here in Connecticut with Pequot's War, or the Pequot War. And then it will completely vanish 30 years later in King Philip's War. The Pequot War had many events. Let me show you just a few images. Well, first of all, here's a kind of a map of all of New England in the 17th century, or some of the towns that have the names we still know today, but the native peoples are listed here, most of them, and where they originally inhabited. But a massacre occurred. The central event of the Pequot War happened in Mystic. Many of you have been to Mystic, right up the coast. It was a horrifying event. About 400 native peoples were trapped in May of 1630. The war had just broken out in April, but by May of 1637, about 400 were slaughtered in a kind of an enclosure, and most of them burned to death at Mystic, now I guess called Mystic Seaport. The English actually were allied with at least two other native groups, the Narragansett and the Mohegans, who had never been fond neighbors of the Pequots. The war finally just ground to an end with what's left of the Pequots. And by the way, I have in the book a brutal, horrific description of that massacre, the burning of these people. I'll let you read that. But it finally ended with a treaty signed in early 1638 in Hartford, the treaty so-called that ends the Pequot War. What was left of the Pequots, by the way, kept moving west, and they came over here to New Haven, what was left of them. And a few of them met up in Hartford with some English soldiers and agreed to a treaty that, among other things, said that the Pequot were declared extinct, a non-people. That wasn't quite true. Now, a little under 30 years later, a war breaks out that had been brewing ever since the Pequot War, is rooted in the Pequot War, but a war that is now rooted in all of the same causes and yet deeper and deeper and deeper into New England life. It's named for so-called King Philip, whose real name was Metacom. He was the sachem of the Wampanoag of southeastern Massachusetts. 3 Wampanoags were executed for murder in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and various native groups declared war, in effect. Metacom, or King Philip, had a dream of a pan-New England Indian empire, an alliance, a pan-Indian alliance, not unlike what Tecumseh would try, more than a century later out in Ohio and beyond. This war would be savage. Villages just destroyed and burned by both sides. At one point, the English had to retreat into what they had as cities, They made their towns and cities into garrisons. They actually ran out of ammunition at certain points. The Indians would raid to get more ammunition. It became an existential fight for the survival of native peoples on the only land they'd ever known, and for the English now, Puritans, who are now the second generation Puritans. They've inherited the fathers' legacies, fathers and mothers. And this existential war would finally be won, of course, by the English. There were horrible massacres in this war. And in some cases now, the battles and massacres ended in large-scale captures of people, captures of Native Americans who were now, in quite large numbers, sold into slavery. Some were actually first put in internment camps out in Boston Harbor and then sold, particularly to the West Indies. We'll talk Thursday more about this West Indian connection, which by the middle of the 17th century, and especially by the 18th century, is becoming the economic engine of Connecticut, and an economic engine for some of the people who founded Yale College. Both sides in this savage battle, according to Andrew Lipman, a scholar of this, quote, had attempted to utterly terrify and demoralize their opposition, but only the English truly succeeded. It was a kind of 17th century version of total war. It's been really the revelation of so much scholarship on King Philip's War in the last, 20 years, 30 years, to realize how big this war was, how pivotal it was, and the legacies it left all over New England. The first Africans in Connecticut that we know of, this is in the Yale and Slavery book, it came here probably during the Pequot War. Probably. Damn. Because what's happening out in the Atlantic? A massive slave trade. And I wanted to show you, this, by the way, was the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's fascinating because the seal actually says, you can't read that, but it says, it's a Native American, half naked, saying to the English, please come help us. Irony makes the world go round. Please come help us. What do you say? And this is an amazing drawing of the massacre during the Pequot War at Mystic. Now, it's, how realistic? I don't know. But this was an artist's depiction of this the year after it happened. This is also in our book. And by 1675, last slide, when King Philip's War broke out, the dark regions are the extent of English settlement. And you'll note it's mostly in Massachusetts, inland quite a ways, but up the rivers and along the coast. That's going to really change after King Philip's War. And the native peoples will all but be liquidated from Connecticut and make possible when these ministers met here. I want to end today, though, with this, because what's about to occur now is Timothy Woodbridge and his 9 companions are going to meet over there in Saybrook with a mission that they've been discussing for quite a long time. Actually, it was John Davenport's dream. John Davenport wanted to create a college, a collegiate school, right here in New Haven as part of the original colony. He never could get enough money out of the colonial legislature, and he will die before he can create that. A college to train ministers, mind you, Calvinist ministers. Those 10 ministers who met up in Saybrook were on a mission to save Calvinism from all of its misguided leaders at Harvard. That's true. Because Harvard was just, going to hell in a handbasket. They weren't holding on to Calvinism very well at all. More on those 10 ministers and Timothy Woodbridge Thursday. But let's end with this. What's going on out in the Atlantic? Slave trade. One of the most spectacular poems, historical poems, I've ever encountered, and I love using poetry, is by Robert Hayden. It's called Middle Passage, and he aims this at New Englanders. Middle Passage, voyage through death to life upon these shores. Standing to America, bringing home black gold, black ivory, black seed. And here he's aiming at the Puritans. Deep in the festering hold thy father lies. Of his bones New England pews are made. Those are altar lights that were his eyes. Deep in the festering hold thy father lies. The corpse of mercy rots with him. Rats eat love's rotten, gelid eyes. But oh, the living look at you with human eyes, whose suffering accuses you, whose hatred reaches through the swill of dark to strike you like a leper's claw. You cannot stare down that hatred. You cannot stare down that hatred. The lights in a New England church, he says, those are the eyes of the slaves. The pew you're sitting in, the bones of the slaves. That's poetry. Okay, Thursday we'll pick this up with the founding of Yale and its growth in the 18th century up to the Revolution.